This is Greg James.
And I'm Alice Levine, and you're about to watch a live podcast from Crosswires Podcast Festival here in Sheffield.
Imagine the Edinburgh Fringe, but with podcasts.
You can see Dig It with Zoe Ball and Joe Wiley.
You can watch Sort Your Life Out Unpacked.
And brand new Uncanny Cold Cases.
To watch more shows, just search for Crossed Wires and enjoy the podcast.
Hello, it is Chris at the Crosswires Festival in Sheffield.
And it's Faisal also at the Crosswires Festival in Sheffield.
And in front of us, a fantastic audience. And for people listening or watching at home or in the car or walking the dog, let's see, we've had the full range of sound effects already, but can we have, a big newscast whoop or something? That was impressive, wasn't it? That was impressive. Let's dive in then, Faisal, to a conversation about Andy Burnham. And there is so much to get into, not least in the last 24 hours. In fact, last night, he gave his first interview since winning the by-election in Makerfield, those collections of towns and villages broadly to the south of Wigan in Greater Manchester, to Andrew Marr on LBC. And, he turns up, doesn't he? He has a copy of the government's defence investment plan tucked under his arm. These things don't happen by accident when people turn up for media interviews with stuff under their arm. He acknowledged that, turns out he didn't know everything about that, including that he's going to have to work out how to pay for a fair chunk of it. And what other things, Faisal, did you tease out of what we heard from Andy Burnham last night?
I think, like the speech on Monday, he's trying to sort of operate, sort of bounce along the top of the argument he's trying to make without getting into a great deal of detail. He's trying to sort of set up the tram lines. He's still, I discern, it makes more sense if you think of it theoretically that he thinks he's still in a Labour leadership contest. And so in his eyes, he doesn't have to sort of go into the fine details of the actual trade-offs that we would want to know about, that you would imagine that in any contest, he'd have to make some decisions that become consequential for years and decades to come. We were talking on Newscast a couple of days ago about how, David Cameron made a decision exactly in this situation when trying to fight off the right of his party that ended up probably with Brexit, which was arcane decision to leave the grouping of Conservatives. So it's consequential what happens at this moment, but it seems tactically that he's trying to basically get through the next couple of weeks without creating any hostages to fortune that he doesn't have to if, as we expect, you'll know more about this, definitively there isn't going to be another challenger.
Yeah, so what we have at the moment is, and it's an extraordinary thing to witness. I spent a fair amount of time in the last 5 or 6 weeks in those communities in the Makerfield constituency. And, here was a guy having a tilt, returning to Westminster in a tricky seat for him to contest, with every prospect he could become Prime Minister in pretty short order afterwards. And a fortnight ago, I was on the turf of Ashton Football Club, where he gave his victory speech. And he was sufficiently keen to avoid reporters' pesky questions or pesky reporter questions, in other words, folk like me, that he was showing a dab hand at sort of somersaulting over picnic tables and to try and get away from us, basically. And last night, nearly 2 weeks on, was the first time that he'd taken questions. He didn't do that at his launch event in Manchester the other day. I think it's perfectly reasonable for us journalistically to aspire to ask questions and to point out when politicians won't take them. As Faisal hints at, I think the strategy from his team is you can create one heck of a lot of hostages to fortune when you are, to all intents and purposes, a prospective Prime Minister, because it's legitimate for us to ask him about anything. And everything. And he could end up saying something that would cause him grief down the track. I think it's also worth pointing out, it is quite something, depending on what he does in the next few weeks, that if, as is likely, he becomes Prime Minister 2 weeks on Monday, he will have arrived at that point with a minimal level of scrutiny, because there won't be, it would appear, any contest, which exposes any candidates to a certain amount of scrutiny. We saw that with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak a couple of summers ago, and he is clearly being careful about the public scrutiny that he puts himself up for. A couple of other things that he said in that interview last night. He talked about not wanting to make, as he put it, crude cuts to benefit levels, but he does want to get the benefits bill down. pulling off both of those things is not necessarily straightforward. And he wants to emphasise, doesn't he, Faisal, in your wheelhouse economically, that he can be disciplined with the public finances. We'll come on to the remark he made 6-7 months ago that set lots of hairs running, 8-9 months ago, around that. But he's clearly trying to emphasise that the city, the markets, they can trust that he's credible.
So I do discern that if you were going to take away the messages here that he is trying to land in this period, this strange period we have right now, it is a message to the markets, which is, I'm going to stick to the borrowing rules. Also, the welfare lean is designed to sort of say, I don't. Clearly, he's saying that he can make these cuts in a more politically sustainable way. And if the markets are they don't just think one thing, right? They want to know that a prime minister or chancellor's sums add up, but they also want to know that a political leader can get their agenda through Parliament. Now, the astonishing thing about the past couple of years is we discovered that a Labour leader with a majority of 160-odd couldn't get what they announced through Parliament. And so there's two things about this sort of transition period. It is, does he sustain the authority, or does he regain, one might even argue, the authority over the full PLP? Does he inherit
Labour
that
MP.
in a couple of weeks' time in its entirety? But also, does he bend that to his agenda? How much authority does he have, as well as the agenda? He did, though, choose to make this remark, and it's a remark I think that Tony Blair, the guy that once appointed him to government, not to cabinet, it was Gordon Brown that wanted to government. It was particularly, he objected to particularly, which was this, like, it's an end to 40 years of neoliberalism, which is, an interesting phrase. And he referred to the trickle-down effect. Clearly, that is an attempt from him to foreshadow a slightly different economic agenda, but also to appeal from a totally different angle to some of the voters that Labour Party Reform have been fighting over the past couple of years. And that is the fundamental question now. Does Andy Burnham plus this agenda about, well, not just the agenda, but just saying, I'm going to do these things, I'm going to try and rebuild Britain, whether that appeals to the same voter from a different direction to the success Nigel Farage and Reform have had in the polls over the past couple of years.
I'll tell you what we thought we'd do. So we've just done a little, if you like, précis of the last 24 hours and the arguments that Andy Burnham is making right now. I reckon what we could usefully do in this episode of Newscast is rewind back and pool our collective...
Imagine one of those DJ, like, scratchy bits where it goes...
Exactly. Pool our kind of collective sense of Andy Burnham, the politician, and the journey both geographically and politically that he's been on to arrive at this point. And what's so striking, plenty of us as political journalists are rereading at the moment a book, Head North, written by Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham, who's the Labour mayor of the Liverpool city region, that they wrote a couple of years ago. And what is really striking about this is the opening chapter runs through this city and the extent to which, formatively, politically, the Hillsborough disaster was so central to them both, and their diagnosis as they saw it, of it being a case study amongst many, as they see it, of state failure, of a capacity for a state to overlook, ignore, or even look down on in injustice. And that runs central to Andy Burnham's book here. Just to canter through, Faisal, his early political history. So Andy Burnham grew up kind of halfway between Liverpool and Manchester, goes off to Cambridge University, talks about the imposter syndrome he felt when he was studying there, becomes, and this is interesting in the context of someone who now defines himself in many senses against Westminster, becomes, if you like, a creature of Westminster as a pretty young guy, as a special advisor when Labour were in government in the late 90s and early 2000s. Then becomes an MP in Lee, which is very close to where he now represents in Makerfield. And as you were saying, Faisal, rises to become a minister and then a cabinet minister under Gordon Brown. And in and amongst that time, I guess, is when you first encountering journalists?
Oh yeah. It's quite. I haven't told this story before. It's in 2007, and I know it's the wrong part of the Pennines, but there's a very famous son of Manchester, Anthony H. Wilson, who founder of the Happy Mondays and the Hacienda, and I was introduced to Andy Burnham by Tony Wilson at Tony Wilson's music festival. And you had, I think you must have been culture secretary at the time, but
Who was playing at the festival?
No, well, no, I had Tony Wilson's grime band, which didn't really go very far. But in actual fact, those of you that know Anthony H. Wilson, he's a sort of legendary figure in the Northwest and in Manchester, Mr. Manchester, as he was called. But there's something of his history in that part of the world, in the Northwest, that I think Andy Burnham tries to channel. And I think, I can't remember who said it, that Burnham's a mixture of Harold Wilson and Tony Wilson, which I thought actually let's see where that one goes. But how I describe it is kind of local patriotism that Westminster politics doesn't necessarily get, sees as parochial, assumes is kind of fake, right? Assumes it's like, and you see this word chippy northerner. You see that.
Never heard of it.
In the lobby. No, but you see that, and it's like, this guy, he's a Cambridge University educated, but actually it's a fairly, and in its own way, and we can get into how the northwest of England differs from the northeast of England at some point. But I think
not forgetting Yorkshire in the middle.
Yes. Well, I've committed a cardinal sin here, but I think that the agenda that he outlined on Monday on devolution and on an over-centralised UK, and on the numbers behind that, things like the Treasury tables that show the spread of transport infrastructure spending. There is a narrative that has been discussed, not just in the Northwest, but the Northeast. These numbers, this argument, the fact that, there's only, across the Pennines, essentially, if you're trying to get from here to Liverpool, there is one platform 13 and 14 at Piccadilly Station, that every train has to go through, that wouldn't be allowed in any other second, third, fourth city in any European country. They would have had the investment there. But in the UK, with its centralisation, the Treasury having to tick everything off, even down to the equation that determines where investment goes, this is a well-worn argument across the north of England. It's not like, oh, you're just affecting this because you want to get the votes of these. It's a well-worn argument, it's well-developed, and it's clear that he has long believed these arguments. And as I saw it in 2007, I went back to one of my interviews I did with him 6 years ago when they were reforming what's known as the Treasury Green Book rule, arcane rule.
And this, to explain to newscasters, is how the Treasury attempts to attach a kind of value for money metric to our taxpayer pound.
On a big infrastructure project.
Yeah.
And because it sort of values economic growth, it tends to bias investment to where the growth is already happening. So you then get this sort of chasing the tail kind of, well, the growth's happening here, so we've got to invest here. So the growth happens there, so we're going to invest here. And then if you were to describe the development of the UK versus like Germany, what would you have? You'd have a southeast sort of growing like this and an emptying out of the economy elsewhere. And that is not a bad description of the United Kingdom, of England. And it's a choice, is the point. And I think that's what Mr. Burnham's saying. And it's a choice that other countries haven't made, which is why he was referring to Germany. So I guess you go back through that history. There's a hinterland in culture. There's a hinterland in there being something different in the north of England. What is fascinating is that he really went for that on Monday as his kind of credo. We didn't get the detail, as the way in which he wants to be judged.
And what was interesting was that his team, prior to that speech on Monday, grounded in that idea of devolving power, in England in particular, but he made some references to the nations beyond England as well, is that they do see that, his team, as the foundational text of how he aspires to govern the country. And it's intriguing, isn't it, Faisal, that a critique that is levelled at Andy Burnham and has been for years is his, as critics see it, his fluidity about what he believes. The old line that has become something of a cliche at Westminster because it's been said so often that a Blairite, a Brownite and a Corbynite walk into the bar and the barman says, "What are you having, Andy?" Because his argument is he's loyal to Labour leaders and he will serve under Labour leaders, whoever they are. But whilst there are plenty of individual policy areas where he has changed his view, and we can have a discussion about whether changing your view in politics is a laudable thing or not, on this creed of diagnosing a central problem in the UK and in England in particular of over-centralisation, there's a thread of consistency going back a long way.
Yeah. There definitely is. And then that feeds in to a moment in 2017 where he's in Parliament.
Hold that thought for just a second, because we're going to rewind.
Oh, no, sorry, we're going to get...
We're going to rewind to 2015 first, because Andy Burnham's ambitions are not new. In fact, this is his third attempt at becoming Labour leader. He had a crack at 20 in 2010, and he had a crack in 2015. And in 2015, the whole idea, car share, the series, was a bit of a thing at the time. And there's no such thing as a new idea in broadcasting, certainly not for me anyway. So I thought I would do a political equivalent of car share.
With the karaoke?
No, mercifully.
That would have been good.
For all concerned. But with the four candidates to be the then aspiring to be the Labour leader, including the guy who could soon be Prime Minister. So let's have a listen to that from 11 years ago.
I think people were quite numb maybe after the last time. We're just out of government, and I think people were still not quite ready to have that kind of real, deep, soul-searching type debate. Whereas this time, that has definitely happened.
And you're having another crack at the leadership.
Yeah, last time. I won't be doing it again. For me, this is it's now or never.
Right,
really,
right. Now or never.
It's so cute how you both wore ties and stuff, isn't it? It's fun. It's funny.
Oh, thanks.
I know.
I'm still wearing a tie, apart from today. What was interesting, by the way, about that car share is that Jeremy Corbyn refused to do it. He said, because he was keen on emphasising public transport. By the way, I think the health and safety folk were a bit more laissez-faire back then. I'm not sure they'd let me do that these days, because it's quite hard interviewing a politician. Then you're doing it trying to drive around roundabouts and stuff. But, Jeremy Corbyn's team said, no, we don't want to do it in a car. Can we do it on a bike?
Yeah. One bike.
Well, this is the thing. And then our technical guys were saying, well, it's a bit tricky because, it's quite noisy when you're on the street in a bike. Will you be able to hear each other?
Yeah.
And then someone said, what about a tandem? And I said, I'd be up for a tandem. It seemed a bit bonkers, but it's not. Again, it's not unprecedented because nerdy newscasters amongst us might recall Jeremy Paxman and Boris Johnson doing an interview on a tandem. I think to mark Jeremy Paxman leaving Newsnet. I think that was the reason for it. Anyway, I digress some distance from our controlling thought this afternoon. So Andy Burnham stood again. That was his second time. And somebody rather acidically put it to me a couple of weeks ago, Andy Burnham, that he has fought the Labour leadership twice and lost to two losers. Because Ed Miliband won in 2010 and lost the election in 2015, and Jeremy Corbyn won in 2015 and lost elections in 2017 and 2019. It would appear Andy Burnham has found a solution to that problem, which is ensure that there aren't any other contenders. And also this time, of course, the leadership comes with becoming Prime Minister, which wasn't the case on either of those occasions. Faisal, from your perspective as a former political editor, a current economics editor, and a Mancunian, unpack how we should digest Andy Burnham's record in Greater Manchester and the extent to which he can or can't take credit for some of the things he would point to as things that he's done.
So, over the past decade, it is true that Greater Manchester has outperformed other city regions and the average of the UK growth, just in terms of the growth.
Which is a line he likes to use.
And it's about 3%, and a year sustained over 10 years, which sort of happily for him coincides with when he was there. Now, the correlation is not causation, one might argue, and it is, as you say, I say a 30-year project, a conscious 30-year project that is particularly timed probably with something happened exactly 30 years ago, which was the IRA bomb in Manchester, and it's kind of more to do with long-term thinking of people channeling what I referred to before, actually people like Tony Wilson, this sort of local patriotism, but also probably having the levers of power that you get when there is essentially a one-party state, right? That's what it was, more or less. And what I mean by that is that they had the freedom to be extremely ideologically flexible from that base, and to engage things over the long term, and to take some risks. So a classic example was a deeply controversial decision back in the early 2000s to build a super casino. It was a Tony Blair initiative. Gordon Brown famously cancelled it. But Manchester was the sort of place where they're like, right, the super casino's gone. That's what we were going to do with the East of Manchester. What are we going to do now? We've got Commonwealth Games Stadium. Right. Let's get the guys in from Abu Dhabi to buy Manchester City. They've got loads of money. They're going to invest loads of housing. We'll basically let them take over this part. That was also controversial. These are the sorts of decisions you can take when you've got kind of, and that are controversial. However, they do yield some results and lever in investment. Likewise, the investment and the Shining Towers are definitely there. But the essential strategy is from 30 years, which is Manchester, and there's some similarities with Sheffield and Leeds, has a significant concentration of graduates. It's the biggest university campus in Europe. Never really leveraged that. People often left. Keep the graduates, create jobs that create growth, that keep growth, that get people living in the city centre, get them to live in the city centre, get them to spend their money in the city centre, and create a sort of virtuous circle that way. And so it's a type of service sector growth, and then sort of persuade and ask the question, as their marketing campaigns did, to the big corporates that routinely assumed they had to set up in the southeast. Why are you spending that money in the southeast when you can employ the same graduates in the north? That was the sort of very broad agenda, and it came to fruition. It comes to fruition very visibly in the past 10 years.
So let's fast forward then to the last year or so. And Faisal, I think what's interesting here, and this actually speaks to an element, if you like, of the consequence of the devolution within England, the handing of power away from London to English cities and city regions, and then the extent to which that can cross-pollinate back into the Westminster ecosystem. I recall going to Conservative Party conferences where the vibe and the conversation was all about the then kind of prince or king over the water, one Boris Johnson, who happened to be mayor of a city called London. And fast forward to the last couple of years, where Labour have been having their annual conference in Liverpool, and there was an equivalent thing where Andy Burnham would often pop in for a few days, would be holed up in a hotel just beyond the official conference barriers, and people would be called in for a bit of a chat, and he'd be sort of setting out his stall a bit. And we'll fast forward in a second to a clip from around about this time, but we should just nod to, because this is right at the heart of where we were when we were reflecting at the beginning of this recording. Prior to the Labour conference of last autumn, Andy Burnham gave a couple of interviews, but one interview in particular to the New Statesman magazine, broadly on the left of politics, where he was fleshing out this idea, wasn't he, of Manchesterism. And in the context of that interview and a subsequent interview from memory that he gave in the Telegraph, was this line that he's been seeking to deal with ever since, including in that interview on LBC last night, about the not being in hoc to the bond markets. And Faisal, for our newscasters, I guess a précis of the bond markets and their significance, and then I guess the difficulties had around that.
Yeah. So we are dependent upon the bond markets in order to, because we've got significant deficits, and when they see political turbulence, when they see budget maths not adding up, when they're not sure if governments can pass their budgets, they say, okay, well, we're going to charge you more. It's a very simplistic explanation, and it has been, obviously a massive feature of the mini budget issue was around a spike in those rates. So he made those comments, and they were seen as the sorts of comments that in this world, and the UK has been sort of singled out generally because we're more dependent on high gas prices, because we've had this history of political turbulence over the past decade. it seemed to be a risky thing for him to suggest. I think his argument was slightly more subtle, or after the event, he said what he was trying to say was that it was a critique, actually, probably more subtly, of leaving yourself in the position where the bond markets are constantly exposed. So you can sort of, for example, and it gets very nerdy, this, the reason why Rachel Reeves had to do the U-turn on welfare was because she had to find $5 billion very quickly in March because they decided to test the fiscal rules and borrowing rules every 6 months, whereas you didn't need to do that. You could have sort of, that equally, and she changed that, and that equally could have been what he was sort of half pointing at, but he was saying that, that politicians should decide what they want to do, enact it, and be less bothered. The idea that you should be less bothered about the bond markets. And it's absolutely correct to say he sort of rode back from that, or sought to clarify, I think is probably the word, what he means by that, and what we've heard since the beginning of him standing for Parliament was the idea that he's going to stick to the borrowing rules, and he's going to stick to the manifesto, which means the fundamental fiscal constraints that were so difficult for this administration that's
will be broadly the same.
Will be in broad terms the same. Yeah.
So let's again remind ourselves, if you like, of the delicate dance really that politicians always have to perform when their ambitions are clear and they're seeking to flesh out their ideas in the way that Andy Burnham was in those interviews last autumn. But when they are then confronted by binary questions and have to do a bit of verbal dancing, here is Andy Burnham on BBC Breakfast in November of last year.
I think Sir Keir Starmer would be very surprised in his first year as Prime Minister, more than a year now, that there has been talk already of a challenge. And you have not yet, and please correct me if I'm wrong, ruled out challenging Sir Keir Starmer as Prime Minister.
Do you know, though, Nigel,
can you rule that out
one of the
at this moment in
frustrations
time
I
now?
find is that when Westminster goes into a sort of meltdown, I'm always sort of dragged into it. I haven't launched any leadership
but do you
challenge.
rule
I'm
out
doing my
challenging?
job to the best of my ability, and I'm trying to help the country and the government by putting forward the kind of plan that I'm putting forward today. Constantly answering hypothetical questions.
No,
I know
actually,
the media likes that.
I will
but actually, I think people at home are thinking, well, who's going to put forward solutions to where the country is? And that's what I'm doing today.
This is not a hypothetical question because you have said on record that colleagues have urged you to stand. Therefore, it is a valid question to ask you if you would consider.
But go on.
If you would consider, or if you will rule out challenging Sir Keir Starmer as Prime Minister.
I am not going to sit here this morning and kind of rule out what might or might not happen in the future, because why would I? I don't know what the future will hold.
That is what good journalistic scrutiny looks like, I say, from Naga Manchetti. And she was right, it wasn't a hypothetical, was it, as it would turn out. Equally, from the politician's point of view, these things are always publicly something of a delicate dance. And of course, Faisal, at this point, Labour were encountering trouble. Keir Starmer was encountering trouble. The Labour movement by the tail end of last year and the beginning of this year was frankly petrified about the English local and Scottish and Welsh devolved elections in the May of this year. And not long after that interview in the November, there was briefing to me and others from those seeking to be loyal and were loyal to Keir Starmer, saying that he would stand in any imminent contest because they feared a challenge in particular from Wes Streeting as soon as immediately after the budget, which was just before Christmas. So all of this was bubbling away as we headed then into the early months of this year towards the spring, and the by-election triggered in Gorton and Denton in Greater Manchester. There'd been so much talk for so long at Westminster amongst political journalists about what possible route back might there be for Andy Burnham, where realistically he's going to want to contest a Greater Manchester or certainly northwest of England seat. Perhaps he'll venture towards Merseyside because he has Merseyside connections, lifelong Evertonian, etc., etc. I must admit there was a splash of ageism that went on amongst political journalists because we tended to look at both the size of the majority in Labour seats and also the age of the incumbent, suspecting that everything else being equal, older folk might be more encourageable to stand down. Turns out in that sense we were totally wrong. We were also conscious of him being aware of how transparent it might look like if someone stands down in order to engineer his return. And that's why Gorton and Denton had a certain sort of gravity to it at the beginning of the year, because a seat had come about as a result of the ill health of a sitting MP. No one disputed the reality of that. And therefore, here was this seat that had long been held by the Labour Party in Greater Manchester, which Andy Burnham wanted to stand in, and where Keir Starmer, who was wildly more powerful then than he was to be just a handful of months later, was able to say, get lost, basically. And he had so much power on the NEC, the National Executive Committee, the kind of governing body, if you like, of the Labour Party, that you have this very prominent, clearly ambitious figure in Andy Burnham seeking to contest a by-election in his own city region, and the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, ultimately says no, which triggers a fascinating thought experiment before we leap on to the realities of what was to come, which is, imagine a scenario where Labour had said yes to him standing in Gorton and Denton. All of these are leaps of hypotheticals. And imagine, given Andy Burnham's brand in Greater Manchester, he had won that seat. As you might recall, the Green Party won that by-election. The by-election for the Manchester mayor's job would have been on the same day as the English local elections. Could have potentially been very, very tricky for Labour, and they were fearful of losing that, particularly if it happened on the same day. And Gorton and Denton, everything else being equal, if Andy Burnham had won that seat, would have been a less convincing argument to his own side that he had the capacity to be as politically vital as he was able to later, he would argue, prove, or at least have a proof point of, in winning a seat like Makerfield, which was much more reform in its recent political affiliation, having backed reform very strongly in those local elections. So you just imagine that alternative scenario. Would the Prime Minister have been challenged sooner? Would the path to Downing Street have been harder for Andy Burnham? Would he have been more likely to face a contender, a rival in a leadership race, had his first attempt at a route back not been blocked in the way that it was?
Looking at that clip and hearing you there, I'm really struck about like how do you define political strength? Is it strong to block someone? What's wrong if you're in a broad church political party with asserting different policy priorities? If everything's going really well, maybe, but like if things, I find it astonishing again, as still see myself as an outsider to your world, Chris, but like, the idea that I don't recall seeing, Labour mayors that have phenomenal personal mandates, like Sadiq Khan, like they don't get to do big speeches at Labour Party conference. And all this stuff is like, you sort of give lip service to spreading power around the place. Localities, regions vote for people, and then they literally don't even get to give a speech at your conference, and it seems quite odd. And then the other reflection I would have looking at it is you could look at that and say that Mayor Burnham does seem rather consciously to have modelled his approach to this like in a way that Boris Johnson did, sort of popping up at conference, a bit of a scrum around everything that he did. It becomes the alternative pole of power.
Not least because the very essence of the mayoral model, and it's a contested idea as to whether having a mayor as the figurehead of your region's politics is better than the alternative. There are those who would argue, and in fact some places have reverted back to a more conventional kind of cabinet structure of within councils, etc., etc. But what advocates of the mayoral model will emphasise is that you do have that. You have a figurehead who will often become almost like a first name terms politician, and with that, you can become the voice of your region that can rise above political affiliation, and you are arguably to an even greater extent than a Prime Minister within a cabinet model. You stand head and shoulders in prominence terms above anyone else, which, if you have aspirations beyond your current job, is a great launch pad. Oh, and the other thing is you have plausible detachment from your party hundreds of miles away at Westminster.
And the difficult decisions and trade-offs. And I'm just conscious that it may appear that we're talking about personalities here, but there's policy substance underpinning these tensions. So at this time that you're describing that, his team are getting very, very upset about feet dragging, as they saw it, over the Northern Powerhouse rails.
Andy Burnham's team getting...
Yeah, and Steve Rotherham's team.
Yeah.
And it was meant to be announced at the infrastructure strategy. You know, it seems a bit odd that there was infrastructure strategy and it wasn't mentioned, investment strategy. There were some issues with the Treasury numbers. Then it was going to be Keir Starmer's big announcement at Labour Party conference. Would have made some sense in the region. That didn't happen. And so they were beginning to think that it was getting suffocated and buried. And they were really quite upset about that, as they were upset with what happened, was it 2 years previously, when under a different government, Rishi Sunak, there was this whole thing where Rishi Sunak went to Manchester to cancel the train line to Manchester. It was always like, you know, it was like, I always thought, okay, that's an interesting one, isn't it? You know, it's sort of, what would you call the opposite of pork barreling? You know, it's like, I think I can think of some phrases, but probably not for a family podcast. But they were. It became and then it goes to the whole thing about the frame within which we see the country.
And not just that, but an argument that Andy Burnham tries to frame his current pitch around, which is putting place before politics. And I recall being in Manchester at that Conservative conference, and Andy Street, who was the then Conservative mayor of the West Midlands, was furious about the HS2 decision north of his city region, heading to Manchester.
And if you fast forward a little bit, all of this stuff now becomes presumably back on the agenda. There is policy substance to this, and the vista, and indeed the vista of HS2, for example, quite rightly is referring to how much money was wasted, but like from parts of the north, it's how much money was wasted on a project that was designed to help the economy of the north or reconnect the country on beautifying it in the south of England.
Yeah.
Right, that's... Yeah.
Conscious that we should soon be hearing from our newscasters here in Sheffield, but just to sort of fast forward, and I'll do this bit as pithily as I can, because this is where we get into the news of now, really, which you'll be hearing plenty of already, which is, what is the controlling thought at the heart of the Labour Party argument that has brought us to this extraordinary moment where a Prime Minister who won so comprehensively in terms of a majority just a couple of years ago at Westminster, albeit on a small share of the vote, is about to depart office. And at the heart of that, and the current Prime Minister has talked about this publicly, and it's a key part of the argument that Andy Burnham has been making in the last couple of months, is that Labour have been frightened, and frightened is to underplay the scale of the emotional fear that they have about the rise of Reform UK. They fear being the government that turns out to be the inadvertent midwives of a Reform government. And Keir Starmer has articulated that publicly and hoped to make an argument to his own side and as well to the country that he could be the viable alternative to that. But such was the backlash electorally, particularly in those elections a couple of months ago, that the viability of that argument from Keir Starmer's perspective with his own side drained away. It drained away. And what turbocharged that, because it was the equal and opposite in the other direction, was that the contest that Andy Burnham fought in Makerfield, of all places, which was not in the handful of most likely seats on most of our journalistic bingo cards of the ones he would fight in the Northwest, allowed him to prosecute an argument which we'll hear plenty of in the coming weeks, that he took on Reform in their own backyard. They won so handsomely at the local elections, albeit in a parliamentary seat that Labour have won for decades and decades and decades. And therefore, one of the reasons we're now standing on the cusp of a new Prime Minister who is not going through, as things stand, an internal leadership race, is that he was able very definitively to point to his capacity to beat Reform. Now, granted, and this is the twist, and this is the big question for the coming years, he proved that in a region where nobody, at least at the moment, questions his political popularity. Does beating Reform, if you are Andy Burnham, in Makerfield, translate to beating them in Barnsley, or in Doncaster, or in Gateshead, or in Sunderland? Big, big question. But that's how we've arrived at where we are now, with him being the presumptive next Prime Minister, having taken on and won, even though the numbers in the end were pretty comprehensive, a risky by-election, which would have finished him politically if he'd found himself on the other end of it. I reckon it is time for us to take some questions. How about that, Faisal? I don't know, how are we doing this? Are we, we've got a box.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Look at this. You half expect some sort of rabbit to pop out of it.
I think I know I may be able to queue up the first question, which has been sent in by a BBC colleague.
It's been another difficult and challenging week for Chris Mason. And now, to top it all off, there's an impressionist doing an impression of him. But the question that we all need to know the answer to is, will Chris Mason enjoy it, or will it make him physically sick?
That was your friendly colleague, Kieran Hodgson from Dead Ringers.
That was the most unenthusiastic round of applause that I offered. the one in the room was, well, thank you for that. I've never used hair gel in my life. For those watching, there's definitely a gap there. Was there a question in there? I wasn't really listening.
Well, yeah. Are you enjoying it?
Well, look, it's an interesting question. That I wrestle with this journalistically around moments like this because, of course, if you're in political journalism, when you see the transition of power from one prime minister to another, and my goodness, I've seen a few now, that is obviously a very live, dynamic moment. And journalistically, if you're a political editor, prime ministers changing is a big moment.
It's Paul Glass, though.
Well, but it's not a game and it's not entertainment.
Yeah.
And it matters because it matters about the direction of the country, and it matters about economic policy, and it matters about jobs, and it matters about regional development. So I do wrestle with that. So Nick Robinson, one of my predecessors, was the BBC political editor for 10 years, and he reported on 3 prime ministers. I was on my 3rd prime minister inside 6 months of doing this job. And I'm about to...
Maybe it's your fault.
And I'm about to report on my 5th in 4 and a bit years. And so, that does throw up some quite profound questions about how we're governed, our governability, what the underlying factors are to the turnover in prime ministers. Yeah. So journalistically, of course, it's interesting, and of course, it's a fascinating time to do my job. But I balk at that idea around, as I say, it's not a game and it's not entertainment.
It's pretty profound, though, isn't it? Because now, whenever the next general election is, we have to bear in mind that prime ministers haven't lasted the course. What does the mandate mean? How long is the mandate going to last? Let's go.
It turns out the question was whether I was enjoying the impression.
Oh, right. Okay.
And I just gave a load of profound waffle.
Oh, no, there we go. That's what you get. It sparks.
No.
It's beautiful.
It's the answer. No, it's flattering to be impersonated. Yeah. I think that's the answer I meant to give. Is localisation, Nick says, is localisation Andy Burnham's answer to nationalism? Now, nationalism, that's an interesting word to use and means different things to different people in different places, doesn't it? Do you want to have a riff with that?
Well, no, I refer to this phrase local patriotism, which has a history in the big cities of the north, and it has a history that goes back, frankly, to the Manchester Ship Canal, right? And I think it probably is. Now, how do you apply that across the whole nation? It sort of doesn't quite function or work, but so I think it is. Whether it works or not, we're going to find out. He says clearly you can't have the Manchester model applied literally to every corner of the United Kingdom. That wouldn't work. But what you might think about is having enough power such that if you're Liverpool, you focus your education system in a way that benefits, I don't know, the Liverpool docks, or and likewise in other regions. It's asking a lot of heavy lifting from what is a highly technical dispersal of powers that normally takes many years to have impact. I think I'll put it like that, but I think it probably is its equivalent. And it's interesting conceptually.
Now, I have a question here, and I think we've got a roving mic, so we might be able to get this microphone to someone. It's a question... on the back it says, because this is a popular name, so there might be a few Nicks in the audience, but it says Nick, 43. I don't know if that's an address or an age or quite what it is. But if the microphone is roving and Nick, 43 wants to identify
look at that.
Him or herself. Oh, there you are. Hello. I was trying to pick questions from the box, which are ones we've not wrestled with so far. And I've got another one coming up, which is great. Hi.
Hello. So my question was basically, do you think Andy Burnham would be prepared to make changes to things like the triple lock in favour of something like changing the tuition fee structure at universities?
So this gets into, doesn't it, the whole question of intergenerational fairness, and for newscasters wanting a quick reminder, the triple lock is that idea of basically ensuring that pensioners keep up with, or indeed ahead of, in terms of the state pension, how the rest of the economy or workers are feeling. But with the critique, Faisal, pretty widely expressed privately across the political spectrum, that it's just unaffordable, even if politically it's really difficult for parties to unshackle themselves from, because they've promised to keep it.
So this is exactly the sort of question, dilemma and trade-off we would be getting into if there was a leadership contest, and consequential promises would have been made. And I guess if we had a leadership contest, they would have promised all to keep the triple lock. So in a way, the absence of a leadership contest, I think, means that it might begin an argument about it, and even an argument about it is interesting.
A public one.
A public one might. And the incongruence between what people say privately and what they're willing to say publicly, it's like how no one's ever going to even question it. And then privately they say, of course, it's totally unsustainable. And it is an astonishing thing. And it's beholden upon us to tell you that. Like they say privately, totally unsustainable. Publicly, totally, nobody's going to argue with it ever.
But to just unpick what appears like utter hypocrisy there, is that the bind that the politicians find themselves on is they've promised to keep it in a lot of their manifestos.
Yeah.
And so if you want to, as Andy Burnham has said, be faithful to the Labour manifesto of a couple of years ago, then it's something that you can't, unless you're willing to say, well, actually, times have changed or whatever, it's something you can't do prior to seeking your own mandate, in other words, a general election where you promise to get rid of it. And then when you're in a general election campaign, it's quite a hard thing to then promise to get rid of, given the frequency with which older folk vote relative to younger folk.
But enough of his advisors have openly questioned it for us to know that there could be an open question. Our expectation, I guess, politically would be that open question would get shut down fairly quickly, unless, I guess, and I'm just thinking out loud here, I haven't heard this, if you sort of house it within a wider question of how do we deal with social care, how do we have a sustainable pension system going forward? Then, if you solve problems more holistically, maybe out of that, you then have a conversation about moving to a double lock rather than a triple lock. If you show, can you have a reasoned conversation about this? I would say the possibility that there might be a conversation to be had about what happens, and it depends what other parties do too, is higher because he hasn't had to make any firm promises, if indeed it does happen. So are we 100%? What percentage are we? There isn't going to be any type of leadership contest or any last minute? No, but where are we, like 70%, 90%?
Oh, I think it'd be well into the 90s in terms of the lack of likelihood of a contest. And I think what is likely to happen is once we get past the point that nominations have opened, which happens next Thursday, we'll probably, I am told, see Andy Burnham move into a more of a kind of Prime Minister designate, that's my label, not theirs, kind of posture, rather than I'm a candidate and let's see what happens type thing. So we have vanishingly little time left, but the ultimate question to wrestle with. There's no name attached to this, but stick your hand up and own it, because I love this question. Actually, I don't know if it's a question or a statement, because it's got an exclamation mark rather than a question mark at the end of it. Best food, north or south? Well, I'm going to share a little prejudice, which is that I never, ever trust fish and chips in the south of England. Because there's such... I spend so much time in the company of politicians, I know how to get a cheap time. But I genuinely don't, because the expectation in my head around fish and chips is so high that the gap that can exist between expectation and reality is crushing. And so whenever I'm back in Yorkshire and I dash along to my favourite chippy and Skipton, you know, and I know it's going to be good, and it is good. It's meant I've just had to stop. I just don't buy fish and chips in the south. Absolutely.
You don't.
Question about mushy peas on the front row, to which the answer is always yes.
You don't call it guacamole?
No. maybe apocryphal story involving the former US ambassador and Hartlepool.
Yeah.
Come on, Faisal, you've got to wrestle with this question.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be, Greggs used to be solely northern, and now it's everywhere. So, like, I would say, I used to live off the cheese pasty at Greggs. I don't anymore, because probably at this age you probably shouldn't be living off cheese pasties from anywhere, let alone Greggs. But I was obviously northern food, obviously.
I saw you with that massive piece of quiche in your mouth at lunchtime. Thank you all very much here in Sheffield. I hope that has been a vaguely enlightening conversation. It is so wonderful to record a podcast and not to just imagine our audience of newscasters earphones in or eyes on a screen, but to actually have you here in the room, particularly on a day when the sun is shining and you've voluntarily sat in a room without any windows. So Faisal is grateful, I'm grateful, the team that make Newscaster, who are the real driving force behind the podcast, are grateful too. Thank you for coming, and thank you for having us. And Laura and Paddy are back tomorrow, and Henry Zeffman, who may just be in the possession of some news. Thanks for listening. Cheers.